done today. But I think we've all heard that before, so don't wait up, I suppose would be my tip. But where we are as things stand is that we're a month away from the end of the transition period. We still don't know if there's going to be a deal, which matters to us, of course, but it matters even more so to businesses to export or import, because their livelihoods depend on finding out what's going to happen or what the trading arrangements are going to be at the end of the year. And it's utterly irresponsible that we've got this far. So we also know, though, that if a deal is done, it will be, in the words of Alistair Campbell, whose article I read today, an anorexic deal, which is, one step beyond a thin deal. So it will be, of little use to the country as compared to even Theresa May's deal, which was itself a hard Brexit, or indeed a deal that Labour would have put together, or indeed a EU membership. So that's where we are. So I'll pass over to John, and John can tell us whether he thinks there'll be a deal or not. And it would be great, John, to hear your view on the kind of politics that surrounds this as well, particularly for Labour. So go ahead. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Mike. I think it's actually a really good point to remember that hard Brexit has always been on the agenda for the last 4 years, since Theresa May ruled out being the single market. And obviously after she left, then the customs union was completely out as well. So nothing much has changed since then. I mean, when you take out the single market and the customs union, this is really the only kind of deal, the maximum deal that you could hope to get is a zero tariff, zero quota arrangement, which is actually more than what Canada got, because Canada, the CETA deal did retain some tariffs on certain products, for example, on dairy, eggs, I think. So that's so this is so it's not going to be a surprise in a way what the deal looks like in terms of goods. In terms of I presume, I've always said that we'll get a deal, because for the politics of it, which is when push comes to shove, when you get to the end of this process, we are already looking down the barrel with COVID, and I just don't think that the political leadership of this country wants to fight two fires at the same time, not because they particularly care about people or people's misery or anything, just because it makes life a lot harder. It's unnecessary. It makes them look like failures, and most importantly of all, they'll get blamed for it, because it's all very well saying that people won't regret their decision, but for the last 4 years, nothing has actually happened. It's really important to remember that. Brexit has not happened yet. So whenever we've said, well, people will see, there's always been the riposte, which is it's fear-mongering, nothing's changed, particularly after the December 2019 election. People thought, well, that's Brexit done, that's the oven deal, that's the oven-ready deal. Most people, well, a lot of people didn't understand the next phase, which is actually the negotiated trade deal. And I still think that there's an aspect of denial, even in the highest echelons of the Tory party, that basically things will be all right. We'll be all right on the night, because there's still this kind of mental block that says things can't really ever be bad. We're such a developed economy, etc. We've got all these, such incredible resources, etc., that things can't really ever go wrong. But of course, they can and will. And so I don't think that's fully sunk in. It hasn't sunk in with our political leadership, and it certainly hasn't sunk in with the general public either. So when it does happen, deal or no deal, of course, but when that does happen next month, I think there'll be a very rude shock when people think, oh, actually Brexit did have consequences, and here's what they are. And they'll know that it's not because of COVID, because we've lived through the first lockdown and we could see that supply chains held up very well in March and April, which obviously they may well not do after January, because Brexit hits entirely different sections of the economy from COVID. So manufacturing, supply chains, services, etc. So that's that's the first thing. So I do think there'll be a deal. I think that I'm not relying on Boris Johnson's better nature at all. Just from a purely pragmatic from looking through the lens of narcissism, which is the only lens that he really understands. I just think the deal works out for that particular reason. I also do, as a side note, I think it's extraordinary that for the first time since the English Civil War, we're having to assess and analyse a major geopolitical decision, not on national interest or the economy or kind of alliances or allegiances or anything, but what's going on inside the mind of the leader. Not since Charles I has anyone had to deal with such an extraordinary situation. Really, it's not about how many people will die or how many livelihoods will be shattered, how many companies go under. It's what does Boris Johnson think is best for Boris Johnson? And that is so totally beyond our frame of reference that you could kind of spend, you could devote an entire book to it. But that's kind of, I suppose, for a conversation for another day. So yeah, that's the kind of the politics of it. I think, Mike, maybe you want to talk a little bit more about the consequences of that. It's been covered in great detail what the consequence will be, about how, as we know, a deal isn't going to be that different from no deal, because obviously it's going to be good for people, for companies to be able to carry on trading with a zero tariff, zero quota arrangement. But most manufacturing in this country depends on complex supply chains. So it's all very well having, 0% tariffs, but if you're kind of dealing with rules of origin, product accumulation and that kind of thing, then it doesn't help you very much, because if you have goods that come from outside of the EU, then obviously they do incur tariffs, and so your job can be unviable. And obviously with the queues in Kent, the lorry parks, the Kent access permits, people not having the right permits, just-in-time manufacturing, which is so important for food production and for car manufacturing and a range of other things, pharmaceuticals, that's obviously going to be a huge problem as well. So I don't think that that's fully sunk in yet about all the difficulties that will happen if there is a deal, not just if there is no deal. So the other thing is that because the government has not warned people about what's coming, the messaging has been dire. All we've had really is the adverts to say, let's get going and get ready for Brexit. But even now, 1 month to go, we don't know what we're actually getting ready for. Businesses don't know what they're getting ready for. And when the government does talk about it, they're almost blaming business for not knowing what the government hasn't negotiated. So it's completely absurd and preposterous. And of course, we see that the government knows it's going to be a disaster, because any time they have, any opportunity they have to celebrate the benefits that we're about to get, it chooses instead just to ignore them. So Rishi Sunak delivering a statement last week on the economy, the budgetary forecasts, and not mentioning the thing which is about to hit, which is going to be 2 to 3 times more damaging than coronavirus extraordinarily. So that kind of tells you what you need to know. They're in denial. And so if they're in denial, how could the public not be in denial? So I suppose that brings me on briefly to Labour. I'll wrap up after that. So Labour's obviously, I was arguing for, from the very beginning, that Labour should still take on a pro-EU perspective. I said before Starmer became leader that he had nothing to lose from advocating a harmonised Brexit. Now, that could have been the single market and customs union. I understand why that might have been a difficult sell, but I do think that he could have been more proactive in selling a deal. Now, obviously, there are a lot of people, even Labour Remainers, who disagree with that, who said that it tore the party apart last year. Why would you do that again? But I just think ultimately it comes down to, well, I guess a kind of pragmatism and also principle that if Labour isn't defending working people's jobs, then what is Labour for? I think that was a real opportunity missed for the last year, that there hasn't been that engagement. Now, obviously, we've had coronavirus, which is in many ways more serious than Brexit, and Starmer's been absolutely right to focus on that. But I do think that he could have discussed it more, the whole drama of the internal market bill. But now we're here where we are. Obviously, if we go down a no deal scenario, then that's a whole different ball game. I would expect Starmer to clamp down on that very, very strongly, because a deal was promised, a deal must be delivered. But if there is a deal, which we expect there will be, then obviously Labour has 3 key options. The first one is to vote against the deal. That's a disaster, and it's a non-starter, because voting against the deal is voting for no deal, which even Jeremy Corbyn ruled out before the 2017 election. So that is just simply not credible. It's the other option is to vote for the deal. I think, now I understand the appeal of doing that. You kind of put Brexit behind you. You say, yes, we have a deal that was promised. It's not perfect. We'll vote for it. Obviously, the key risk with that, no surprise, is that when Brexit does turn out to be a disaster, the Conservatives will say, well, look, you voted for it. Now, funnily enough, that didn't hurt the Tories too much in 2003 when they voted for Iraq. They were still able to capitalise on the fact that Iraq was a disaster. And Michael Howard, built a lot of the 2005 general election campaign on the fact that Iraq had been a disaster. But I just think it makes it too easy for the Conservatives if they can say, well, look, Labour did this, so this is Labour's Brexit as much as ours. There's no need to do that if you have the option of abstention, which simply requires a little bit of deft communications saying why we're abstaining, because this isn't the Brexit that is going to be good for business. We know Brexit could be, but this isn't a Brexit that we'd have wanted. So we didn't vote for it before under Theresa May or Boris Johnson. Why would we vote for it now? But we're not going to vote against it because we need a Brexit deal. I think that's perfectly acceptable and easy to understand. And it's not going to be a live issue for a few years anyway, to the 2024 election. So that would be my choice. I understand why Starmer might want to go more down the voting for the deal route. But I think there's no ideal option. But the important thing is, none of the options are a betrayal of either Leavers or Remainers. There's no good option. We have to do the least worst. I think abstention should be the least worst. But frankly, I don't think the voting for the deal will be such a disaster either, because people understand ultimately that it's the Tories who did this. It's not Labour's fault. And obviously Labour wants to avoid as many Brexit fights as it possibly can between now and 2024.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Great, thank you, John. As always, very lucid and helpful. Just let somebody else in. Right, we'll do questions in a little while, but before that, we'll come across to Richard, who you all know, I'm sure. So Richard, obviously, the subject tonight is deal or no deal, and we still don't know if we've got one. It'd be great to hear from you if you have been in touch with anybody in Brussels to get a perspective from there, and otherwise just to get your perspective on A, whether you think there'll be a deal, and B, kind of how you think that it will play out next year, deal or no deal, and also where you think Labour should be positioning themselves now in a vote on a deal, and then throughout next year as the impacts start to become clear. And as I've put in the chat, if you have questions, you can either raise your hand using the participants tab, or you can post your question in the chat and I will ask it. Thank you very much. And Richard, over to you.
Hello, well, sorry to have joined late. I had an overlapping meeting. So I came in just as Jonathan was making the comparison to Charles I, which I thought was a brilliant comparison. And then I listened to everything else he said and I agreed with everything. So I don't think I need to say anything really, because he gave a good analysis of Labour's position as well, and why it's in that position and what it ought to do. Perhaps one little minor quibble is that it's not as though between now and 2014 Brexit won't be an issue, because there'll be a constant litany of problems that have arisen from Brexit. Big ones, job losses, etc., and little irritations from not being able to travel with your pet passports, needing a green card to prove you have insurance if you're driving in other countries, that will grate and irritate people, and the government will be blaming it on the EU, and it's not the EU, it's because we've left the EU and they've not changed their rules. They're applying the rules they already had for third countries, rules that we helped develop. So there will be irritations and issues, and that's, I think, another reason for Labour not to be seen to be endorsing Johnson's deal. But we do know we're going to have no deal or a bad deal. There's no good deal going to emerge in the next few days. We've got to perhaps, those who have campaigned against no deal need to shift the emphasis to say, well, this is now about what kind of deal, and it's a bad deal, and underline all the reasons why it's a bad deal, which we know. Now, Mike, as to your question, have I got any latest news hot off the presses in Brussels? No, the The talks are continuing. They're still stuck on those, ostensibly on those same 3 points, but in reality, as I think I picked up when I first joined the call just now from what Jonathan was saying, in reality, it depends on which way Johnson is going to jump and what's going on in his mind, and how he thinks he will survive as Prime Minister, which wing of the Conservative Party he needs on his side. We know which wing put him to power, so there's a real risk that he leans that way. There are many on the right wing of the Conservative Party who do not want a deal, full stop, because they fear that any deal will keep Britain aligned to a degree at least, with European standards on consumer protection, environmental standards, workplace rights. And that's exactly why they wanted to leave the EU in the first place for many of them. They wanted to break through free of those standards and have a free-for-all market. So there's a real risk well, we know he listens a lot to them. Now, whether that ultimately means no deal or just a bad deal, we should know soon, the next few days, but it's been several weeks now that I've been saying the next few days, so I've given up predicting when it will actually be clear.
Sorry, I'm muting myself again. Great. Thank you, Richard, for that. Sounds like we're all on the same page, really, in terms of where things are. Right, let's have a look at some questions. So, I mean, first question for me, for both of you, is obviously at the moment Labour is planning on voting for a deal if one is agreed sometime this week or potentially in the future, but most likely it will happen this week if it's going to happen. Obviously, we are, as an organisation, and I am personally recommending that Labour abstain on the deal rather than vote for it. And I take your point, Jonathan, that it didn't do the Conservatives too much harm in 2003, but to vote for. But nevertheless, my concern with Labour voting for this is that, I mean, obviously, Brexit has just been front and centre of our news for such a long time, a little bit less so this year, obviously, given the pandemic. But, you know, nevertheless, it's been part of our national debate for such a long time. And indeed, the majority of Labour's voter base always has been and continues to be pro-European and Remain. And my concern is that obviously Labour will be making its choice on how to vote, not based on influencing the Brexit outcome, because Labour isn't in a position to do that in this Parliament, unfortunately. You know, it's basing its calculation on what's going to be the most electorally successful for it in the future. So it's trying to appeal to Leave voters in the red wall. My fear with that is that they won't really get many, if any, Leave voters back, because if people really believe in Brexit, they're more likely to stick with the real thing and continue voting for the Conservatives, but also that they may well both not get back Remainers that we lost last December, because we lost a chunk of Remainers as well as Leavers, and also alienate more Remainers in England and Wales, but also perhaps most importantly in Scotland, where Labour is already on the back foot. It's a very Remain country and will continue to be so. And it just makes Labour's job of staging any kind of recovery in Scotland harder. Do you agree with that analysis, or do you agree with the leadership? Or do you think it doesn't really matter and everybody will have forgotten by 2024 and this is all a bit of a storm in a teacup? Or do you think, I mean, the other end of the spectrum of it's all going to be fine is the Nick Clegg view, not his view, but view of him, in the sense that I would imagine when he trooped through the lobby to vote for tuition fees, he wasn't expecting that vote would end up defining him and his party and his leadership. And there's the maybe fairly small, but there's potential that this vote does the same for Starmer, in the sense that not only is it about will it disappoint a lot of his supporters, but also it's a vote on values. And I think people were not so bothered about Nick Clegg voting for tuition fees, important as that was, but of what it said about him and his trustworthiness and whether he was a man of his word, and so on and so forth. So I worry with this that it could, worst case scenario, admittedly, define Starmer in the same way. I doubt very much is going to happen, but certainly that's a perspective that is going around. So, Jonathan, what do you think? Or do you think this is all a storm in a teacup?
That's a really interesting point about the Nick Clegg thing. I obviously agree with you that it's better to abstain. Another interesting point that just occurred to me, or a point that just occurred to me, is that a lot of Leavers may actually not like this deal for the same reason that a lot of ERGers won't like this deal, because it's a deal. And any kind of deal involves handing over sovereignty. That's what deals do. So, and I'm sure that Nigel Farage will want to capitalise as much as he can on anger. And so it's going to be interesting, because for the next couple of years, anything bad, obviously Remainers will say, well, this is because of Brexit, and Leavers will say, or the hardcore Leavers will say, this is because Brexit wasn't done properly, because it was a sellout, because any deal's a sellout. So maybe that's actually another reason to abstain, is that you can sort of hedge your bets and say to Leavers, well, look, this isn't the Brexit that you were promised, and we knew it was going to be bad, and Leavers, you know, the people in, you know, the red wall seats, won't look at Labour and the Tories in the same with, you know, with the same lens in 4 years' time. So that's just another reason to abstain. As for Remainers, I think that people will be a lot more sympathetic now. Remainers are not going to expect Labour to vote against this deal, because that's for no deal. And I don't think there's going to be much of a difference now between abstaining and in favour of a deal, because Remainers, you know, the Remainers who stayed in 2019, so you don't need to worry about them. The ones that left, you know, that was mainly partly because of Corbyn. They know that they appreciate the difficulty that Starmer's in. I don't think that it's going to be such a big issue for them. The most important thing is to win back the Leavers in the red wall seats. And I think that, you know, for them, many of them will still be devoted to Brexit in 4 years' time. Many of them will have forgotten about it. But I don't think there's a big advantage in voting for the deal if you're trying to get them back.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Richard.
Yes, very interesting points that both of you made there. I think it's still open, by the way, as to how Labour is going to vote. I don't think it's yet set in stone. There's still a big discussion going on right up to the front bench level. And it may even be that Keir wants to be seen as having not rushed into abstaining, but was basically supportive, but in the end will acquiesce, so as he's not so easily labelled as the one that led the Labour Party into that position. I don't know, that's pure speculation on my part. But I think it is open, so all of you who can make a point to your MPs or to anyone you know on the front bench, do so, please. On looking at the chat, I see there's a suggestion that Labour should vote against, that there isn't a real risk of no deal, because well, there's two reasons why voting against might not risk no deal. One is that the government has a comfortable majority and it will get its deal through, especially if the SNP abstains, which we're not sure of. That's slightly risky, because there may be a big ERG rebellion. The state of the Tory party and its divisions at the moment make it hazardous to predict that safely. Possible risk of no deal. The other argument being given is that you can just have an extension. Now, that was true a year ago, where rejecting the deal in fact triggered an extension of the Article 50 deadline, so it was no problem. The withdrawal agreement deal it was at that time. Now, on this future deal, that's not possible. There is no mechanism for extending this deadline. We passed up the opportunity to do that last July. So there is a risk of triggering a no deal outcome if we vote against. And anyway, the debate now within the Labour Party is either abstain or vote for. So I think we should accept that's where the discussion is and argue for abstention. Then finally, the point about how we cope with the red wall. I think Mike's right that we over-egg that in the Labour Party, because one, we're not going to persuade many real leavers. People who stopped voting Labour in the red wall because of Brexit rather than for another reason are not going to be the ones that are swing voters in that. And anyway, overall, in that general election, Labour leaked more of its previous vote to the smaller Remain parties, the Greens, the Lib Dems, the SNP and Plaid Cymru, than it did to the Conservatives. Even in red wall seats, there were 7, I think, of them that we lost by a smaller margin than we lost votes to the Liberal Democrats. So even in the red wall, the argument has to be more nuanced. But looking beyond the red wall, for heaven's sake, the rest of the country, the former red bloc in Scotland, where you know, being seen to be acquiescing in Brexit or lukewarm or not committed doesn't help you vis-a-vis the SNP at all, plus numerous seats across the rest of England and Wales. It's a mistake to focus all our political strategy on what supposedly went wrong in the last general election, which was all about the red wall and Brexit. It wasn't about Brexit in the red wall. It's much more complicated.
Great, thank you both. Right, I'm just having a look through the chat now to see questions. So question from Terence, is this all being used to hide the problems over services? How we'll have to follow equivalence rules that will make nonsense of any idea of sovereignty? John or Richard, you may know more on this than I do, but my understanding is that whether once we're out of the single market customs union, whether we follow rules or not, makes no difference. We still can't trade in services because services aren't included in the deal. Is that your understanding as well? Yeah, Richard's nodding. Great. And I think we've answered Ivor's question on abstention. But Neil, you've got your hand up. So Neil, why don't you go ahead? And if anybody else wants to raise a hand, feel free. But I will look down the chat as well.
Right. Okay. Just a couple of quick points because you guys touched on some of it. I think Scotland is never coming back to us unless we are more pro-EU. The red wall, without taking them for granted, I think A, they didn't want Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. B, they will have seen the reality of what Tory promises are and what Brexit is. So without taking them for granted, I think we can rely on their intelligence and their common sense to come back to us in sufficient numbers that we get the red wall back. As far as how we should vote on this, I think either abstaining is best because this is what's going to happen. If by some miracle Brexit is a success, the Tories are going to walk the next election. Brexit's a failure, we're going to share lane. I think that's something we've got to be very careful about. And when Brexit is a failure, how are we going to explain going from we're not going to rejoin the EU, we're just going to have closer ties, to we're going to rejoin the EU? Because let's be honest, that is going to be our policy, because people, if the door is open left open by the EU, and I suspect Joe Biden is going to pressure them to keep that door open as well, we got to make sure we don't look like A, we're jumping on a bandwagon, and B, we're doing a U-turn, which is what happened with the referendum, because the referendum isn't what sunk us, it's how we approached the referendum and how we explained to people why a referendum was a good idea. So I think we need to sort these kinds of things out. Because I think when Stalin said, we're not going to rejoin, we're just going to settle for closer ties, that is not going to wash with the majority of the country. You know, why have cotton when you can have silk? It's also going to be a political football. When we have Tory governments, we'll have looser ties. When we have Labour ones, presumably we'll have closer ones. And business are going to want to know, well, not going to be able to plan for the future because they won't know who's going to be doing what. You know, it depends on who's in number 10 Downing Street. So I think we need to get these things right. And let's not forget, and I've kept saying this, well, I said this the last time I was on you, most people at the last election voted against Brexit. Didn't vote for it, they voted against it. There hasn't been a credible opinion poll in the last, 11, 12 months that's given a majority for Brexit. So we've got to make sure we're on the right side of history. We've got to make sure we can pivot towards rejoining. Because I tell you this much, I'm 100% certain, I'm not in any kind of denial about this, I'm 100% certain we will be back in the EU in the next decade or two. But I wouldn't bet against a Tory Prime Minister being the one that takes us back in rather than a Labour one. You think about that, but it's probably the truth. Let's be honest. Britain, most people would expect Labour to provide Britain's first, say, ethnic minority Prime Minister. Hands up you who thinks Priti Patel isn't going to be Prime Minister this time next year. But it's the truth that they have consistently defied the things, haven't they? The party that's always been seen a certain way. They were the first, I think, to have somebody with a non-Christian background to be Prime Minister with Benjamin Disraeli. Wow. They've got not one but two women Prime Ministers. You know, only Nixon could go to China. Only a Tory can get us back to the EU, it might be. So appreciate the guys, John and Richard and Mike's thoughts on the babble I've just been spouting.
No, that's great.
May I ask a question?
You may be right.
Mike, before I go.
Just hold on for a second, Philip, because we're just going to deal with Neil's question and then we'll come to you. Is that okay?
That's fine, that, yes. I'm
Great,
still getting used to all this technology.
Okay, great. Richard or John, any thoughts on what Neil has said?
Yeah, well, so some of it was, I think, tongue-in-cheek speculation, but may well prove to be accurate. You don't know, and so on. But I think the fundamental thing we have to consider as Labour Europeans in the Labour Movement for Europe, Labour for European Future, is do we start arguing to rejoin? Now, I'd say probably all of us do want to ultimately rejoin. When is it tactically best to do that? And I think let's see what the litany of problems are over the next year or so, because a lot of them will be things which can be rectified by having a better deal or a closer relationship or plugging a gap in the deal or whatever, from practical things like your European health cards still being valid to joining European research programs. A lot of things you can brick by brick build up a closer relationship. And if public opinion seems to be accepting that, we can then move on and say, well, why not go the whole hog? Especially as quite often building a closer relationship will entail following rules which we no longer have a say on, so we're losing sovereignty. So it's better to be in there and have a voice. But much will depend on what happens with public opinion. And Neil made the point that public opinion did not do what everyone expected after the referendum. People thought it would rally behind the result. We've had our debate, we've voted, it's settled, let's get on with it. It didn't. It edged gradually, but certainly in the other direction. And if you look at the age profile of that, when you break it down by age group, that is likely to continue. So let's not rule out arguing to rejoin, but it's not necessarily right to jump straight in the deep end right now and say rejoin.
Yeah, I agree with that, Richard. I think rejoin is an argument for another election. I just don't think that why would you want to relitigate old battles at the next election that almost tore your party apart at the last one. I think the other thing to remember is that everything is so febrile.
It might be sooner. It might be sooner. We'll see. We'll see.
Well, the election, I very much doubt that. I very much doubt that it will come soon.
The opportunity, the shift in public opinion. And
I think that the shift in public opinion will definitely come, but I think it's almost impossible that Starmer would go into, unless there was a radical shift. I think it's very unlikely that he would want to call for rejoining. Look, but as I say, everything is so febrile. Nobody could possibly have imagined a year ago what would now be happening in the world or in politics. Each week provides new surprises. We don't know what the conversation will be this time next year. Exactly. So much will depend on the vaccine, for example, in terms of COVID. So much will depend on what the quality of the deal is, about how what happens with Boris Johnson if he's still Prime Minister. A few weeks ago, I would have been very surprised if he was Prime Minister this time next year. Now maybe there are slightly better odds, but if it's Rishi Sunak, for example, or Gove, the board game changes again. So predicting what's going to be happening in 3.5 years is a mug's game. But my hunch is that Starmer will not be applying to rejoin. But I think the only thing we do know about the next 3 years is we're going to have a humdinger of a recession, on the par or worse than the 2008 financial crisis. And we know what happened in the 2010 election. So I'm cautiously optimistic about Labour's chances in the next election. But obviously, we don't want to see not at the expense of people's misery. So, there's a lot to find out still.
Great, thanks. Right, we've got loads of questions in the chat. David, we'll come to you. You've raised your hand. So go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. I'm just sort of wondering, I mean, there are some MPs who staked out their position already. I believe Clive Lewis has said he doesn't want to vote for a deal, but I'm not sure actually, but I know he's always been very pro-Remain. Nobody's mentioned the possibility of a free vote. I mean, I don't want to be seen to be propping up Boris Johnson. Nobody
I don't think you could. So just very on that part, I just don't think you can have a free vote. You can't have on the one of the biggest issues of the day. You can't just absolve yourself of responsibility for that. You have to have a party line in a way that Jeremy Corbyn, faced ridicule and he said that he'd be neutral. I don't think that's sustainable now. The party has to have a position on the biggest issue of the day.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. But
Yes,
Philip,
okay.
go ahead, David. Sorry.
MPs, sorry, just
Free vote sends no message other than disarray and division.
Yeah, but I think voting for the deal could be misunderstood.
Yeah,
Well, I agree.
Yeah, so everything's a risk. Everything's a risk for sure.
Right.
Okay, great. Philip, did you have a question? Thank you, David.
Yes. I wish we'd have listened to Richard's analysis more succinctly during the referendum campaign. When I was campaigning for my MP, Mr. Dan Jarvis, it was amazing how many people simply do not understand what Europe's about. The fact that South Yorkshire had a fortune pumped into us since the development funds and research funds and so on, and Dan only got a majority of 3,000. Now, regarding the vote in Parliament, I'm not quite sure what Keir Starmer's position is, but I don't think we should be seen to supporting Boris Johnson because I can't see him getting a deal that's worth a candle. So I would recommend an abstention of voting for Mr. Johnson's deal. And I don't know what Richard's views are, but for the next 4 years, as all this Brexit nonsense unravels, could we go into the next general election with a promise for a new treaty with the EU, a treaty that's not quite as binding, perhaps? I'd really appreciate Richard's comments on that, please, Mike. Thank you for letting me speak.
Okay, thanks, Philip. Richard.
A treaty that's a halfway house that brings us closer to the European Union in a number of respects than the Johnson deal will, but isn't membership. Yeah, that's one of the possibilities, depending on how the debate goes. I just caught sight in the chat column of somebody saying it only took 11 years to restore the monarchy once we'd thrown out King Charles the first. So anything can be reversed within a decade. Well, so I enjoyed that. That was a nice little comment.
That's a good
I think also, yeah, by the way, I think that's actually a really good compromise for Starmer, that we're not going to rejoin. It's too soon. It would alienate a lot of leavers, but we can build on the relationship the government has negotiated. And the other thing to remember is that if we do get no deal, which I think is unlikely, but if we do, it won't be for 4 years. It'll be for a matter of weeks or months. No deal is unsustainable with our largest trade partner. So there will be a deal in 2024, even if there isn't now. I think that we have to understand that. It'll be a huge humiliation for the Conservatives, of course. But Starmer could certainly say we want to build on this. It will really depend on how people think it's going at that time.
Yeah, I agree with you. Right, thanks both. Right, Kat, and thanks to Philip. Carolyn, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I think that the Labour Party is in a dreadfully difficult position, voting for, against, or abstaining. I think it can't do right for doing wrong, so to speak. But I just wonder how much Starmer is doing the right thing because he knows what he's doing and he's a tactician. And the other comment I wanted to make was, do you think, it's been said by Andrew Adonis at a previous meeting, that any deal is better than none, simply because then the Europeans might be more inclined to let us back into the Union on whatever terms they decide. So comment on those 2 points.
I agree with you that Starmer is an excellent tactician. he is absolutely focused on winning power, and he will do what he thinks will enable that. In a way, that actually makes him quite a lot like Boris Johnson. But there aren't many ways in which he's similar to Boris Johnson. I think that's probably one of them.
Yeah.
So yes, he'll obviously be weighing these things up very, very carefully, and he'll be, as we've seen over his leadership, he is much more minded to kind of appeal to leavers than Remainers. Because he obviously feels he has a lot of baggage from his own time as Shadow Brexit Secretary, which the left resents in him as well. So yeah, he'll be going through these options, of course. Obviously, I agree with the proposition that any deal is better than none. But I probably don't agree with Andrew in a lot of ways that the rejoining is going to be a walk in the park.
No,
I don't think selling Schengen and the euro, but then maybe the EU, it really depends on what's happening in the EU as well, because they want us in. So it's not impossible that they could give us preferential, I know, without sounding like a cakeist, they could give us a good deal again. I mean, look, Poland is not in the euro, for example. A lot of countries can sign up something in principle and never do it. So it's nothing's impossible.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Right then, just having a look down the chat. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Richard.
No, I agree with that, and Keir, as a tactician, remember what I said earlier, that it might be the case that for tactical reasons now he is going to acquiesce in an abstention rather than lead us to an abstention. Maybe, we'll see. Maybe I'm being hopeful, wishful thinking. On whether it's easier to rejoin one day if we have a deal, yes, generally it is. But don't underestimate how annoyed the EU is, many EU countries, with the way this government has handled the whole process. Because part of the problem in the negotiations now is Johnson reneging on commitments he signed up to in the political declaration that came with the withdrawal agreement. On what the future relationship would be, which had commitments to a level playing field and so on. And he's just torn that up, just as he's torn up the Northern Ireland protocol. So there's a big lack of trust. And if we finalize it all by storming out without any kind of deal, that will just be exacerbated. If there is a deal, it will be attenuated, though I'm sure they would prefer not to have to negotiate with this lot again. A change of government would be very important there.
I agree. We have our own mini Trump here, don't we, at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And how to get rid of that. Yeah, I think we've behaved absolutely atrociously, and I wouldn't blame them if they told us never to come back again. Thank you.
Right, we've got thanks everybody. Right, we've got a question from Ivor.
Thanks, Mike. I was just wondering if there's a danger to us, to Labour, that we underestimate the visceral attachment that many pro-EU voters actually have to the EU, because in the campaign itself, all the energy, the emotional energy, was actually on the side of the Leave campaign. We made a very cerebral argument why it was simply logical to remain in the EU, and pro-EU voters have seen a situation where, even though they're in the majority now, as all the most recent polls indicate, they were denied a confirmatory vote. And a lot of people, if in the sphere of social media, are saying, I feel politically homeless now. And I'm wondering if we're running a risk there, that we're thinking that these people perhaps don't have anywhere else to go. And of course, at the moment, it would be extremely difficult to rejoin. We've talked about the derogations that we had. Could we get those derogations back? Somebody mentioned Poland. Yes, I mean, there are many pro-EU people, such as myself, who would really not want to get involved in a single currency, who never thought that was a good idea. So we are in a situation where it could be very difficult for us to rejoin. Perhaps the well has been poisoned, at least for the foreseeable future. But my question is really, do we underestimate the intensity of pro-European feeling that is out there? And by doing that, are we running a risk of alienating voters who, even though we might think they've got no other home to go to, will find a home? Because I suspect that if they see the political opportunity the Liberal Democrats will pivot and they will become the pro-EU party again.
I would agree with a lot of that, and I think it's always foolhardy to assume that voters have nowhere else to go, because voters quite often disagree. However, I mean, I think the flip side to that, of course, is that Labour does have a base of support, and also I think if hopefully voters will have a good memory of the 2019 election and remember that fleeing across to the Lib Dems or the Greens or whoever, in the end, under first past the post, it just gets you a Conservative government. So I sincerely hope that next time round voters realise that if they don't want a Conservative government, if they're in a Labour seat, they need to vote for the Labour Party. And they only really have the luxury, if that's what it is, to vote for the Liberal Democrats if they're in St Albans or, one of these other seats that is much more likely to vote in a Lib Dem than the Labour MP. Of course, the flip side to that is that because we follow these things, we know where those seats are. But of course, the vast majority of the population probably don't. And it's, of course, in some ways up to us to tell them. But first and foremost, it's up to the Labour Party to make itself an attractive proposition to vote for. John or Richard, did you want to add anything on that?
I would say that I think you might have. In my opinion, you might overstate the case. I think that Remainers, obviously, there's an emotional attachment. I feel it deeply, but I think that people understand that we've left the EU, and it's not just a question of getting a refund on a bad purchase. There's a whole. It's a long time. It takes a long time to negotiate something new, to go back in it, and the Lib Dems are not showing any sign that they want to be that pro-EU one-issue party again, because they got completely hammered for it. And Ed Davey, I think, has even said that we've left the EU and they're not going to go for rejoin. So I think that there might be a very small number of Labour Remainers for whom Remain will be the overriding issue in 2024. But I think that there will be a pragmatism there that suggests that the best way of getting back in the EU is to have a Labour government, not a Conservative government, led by English nationalists. So even for those people, I still think the Labour will be the better bet, particularly when the Lib Dems are just not going to be. I don't think they'll be making that argument. But as we know, we just don't know what's going to be happening in 2024.
Great, thank you. Right, we are somewhat running out of time, but we've got a question from Neil, after which I will have a flick through the chat and see what I can see. So Neil, go ahead. Relatively quickly, if you can.
Thanks for the second bite of the cherry. Just a quick one. Could somebody clarify on what the Article 49 means? Because I was under the impression that lets us get back in under our existing terms. It's sort of like if Switzerland wanted to join or Norway wanted to join, they'd have to start from scratch. But my interpretation of 49 was that would let us join under our existing terms. And the other thing is, on the point of Europe letting us back in, surely they'd be cock a hoop to do so, because they can use us as a poster child. See, this is what happens when you leave the EU. Even a country like Britain couldn't hack it. Now, do you really want to do what Britain tried to do? I wonder if that might be used as sort of an advert for the EU. Don't do what Britain did. So somebody can answer the question about A49.
Yeah, Richard, I'm sure will go for that. He's your man in legislation terms.
Yeah, Article 49 is the procedure for a country to join the European Union. And legally, it's the same for any country. You have to apply to join, you have to negotiate and sign an accession treaty, which has to be ratified by every member state and yourself as an applicant. So in law, it's quite a high hurdle. Any single country could block us, either on collective EU demands. They might say you've got to rejoin the euro or join the euro, or individual demands. Spain might have something to do with Gibraltar, or Greece might say, yeah, we'd love to have you back in. Fine, as soon as you return the Parthenon friezes, and they would have a point. So it's quite hazardous. Though politically, I think Britain would be in a different situation. Having been a member for nearly half a century, having participated, I think there would be considerable leeway offered to keep the opt-out from the single currency and from Schengen if we so desired.
Great, thank you. Anything to add on that, Jonathan? No? Okay, fine. Right, I'm just going to have a quick flick through the chat, and then we'll have to finish up pretty soon. But thanks for all the questions that people have put in the chat, and with apologies, I've got 81 new messages that I haven't read, so there's zero chance of me getting through all of them, so I'm sorry about that. But starting at the top, Lorena asks, is there anything positive at all in the likely deal that will emerge over the next few days? Well, unless John or Richard know something that I don't know, I don't think so, sadly. It's a bad deal, and it's going to make life much harder for everybody who lives in the UK, and indeed lots who live in the EU, who will also lose out. Candida asked, is it possible that any deal agreed will be agreed so late there will be no vote in Parliament? Yes, although I think that is unlikely because Johnson doesn't need many days to stage a vote in the UK Parliament, but for the deal to be ratified in the EU, and the EU Parliament takes a lot longer because partly they've got to translate it into a whole host of different languages. So I think if a deal happens, there will actually be quite a lot of time for the UK Parliament to ratify it, but a race would be on in the EU to see whether it was possible to ratify it there, which it presumably would be. I mean, I can't imagine at the last minute the EU Parliament saying no, but then as Jonathan, I think, has said many times, we don't know.
The European Parliament has penciled in an extra sitting on the 28th of December to be able to vote that late if necessary. Now, of course, this is actually made easier because thanks to the coronavirus, because the Parliament has introduced remote voting, so members could vote from their own homes. So that's a possible way out on that particular point.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. So Chris asked, if Labour vote for a deal, will Starmer make the appropriate speech that Labour did not own the result in any way? I'm sure he will. I mean, obviously, Labour has no desire to own the results of this deal. And I would imagine that Starmer will say he is voting for it to prevent the worst calamity of no deal, and that the consequences are on the government's head. And as long as that message cuts through to the public, in a sense, it doesn't really matter which way Labour go. My fear is that what he says will be forgotten, but how he voted will be remembered. And I fear that that could play badly for our party. Just having a look at more questions. I'll come to you, Richard and John, in a minute for just kind of final comments, then we will need to finish up at 7 o'clock, if that's all right. So just give me a few seconds to look through the chat, though, as I say, there are loads I'm not going to see, so apologies for that. I think we've answered that question. That one as well. Right, while I look through this, and I may come to one or two more in a second, Richard, could we come to you just for final comments? And did any of your thoughts on what people can do to influence Keir and the party? And then John will come to you, and I'll just have a quick look through the chat.
Well, can I throw another thought in? Because much depends on the battle to control the narrative about what happened and what is happening. And I think in general, it's going to be rather important that we discredit Brexit. It's turning out to be completely different from what was proposed. It's far from saving money that would all go to the NHS. It's costing us a fortune. It's job destroying. It's security destroying. We need to keep on hammering that home so that the public gets or reinforces the impression, because that's the way opinion seems to be going slightly anyway, that this was a national mistake. Now, whether that later leads to the conclusion that we need a closer relationship or we can go all the way to rejoin, we will see later. But we need to reinforce that narrative. And within our own party, we need to be aware of some people who are trying to say this is a left-right division, that, you know, the Corbyn supporters wanted to respect the result of the 2016 referendum and were dragged into supporting another referendum, and Starmer is completely, you know, and the right wing is completely gung-ho on Europe. No, the divisions were different from that. On the anti-European side, you had the Kate Hoey and John Mann and all kinds of people on the right wing of the party who wanted to back the Tories on Brexit. And on the left, you had plenty of strong supporters of Jeremy Corbyn who were strongly anti-Brexit. But there are people like Ian Lavery who are trying to create a narrative that Jeremy was bounced into supporting a second referendum by others. That's not true. I sat through those shadow cabinet meetings and NEC meetings. Time and time again, Jeremy was convinced step by step. It took too long, it was too slow, but he got there in terms of backing another referendum at least. And each time he did that, there were other people trying to row him back. But it wasn't a left-right division. It was so we mustn't let that narrative develop in the Labour Party. Sorry to go off on a tangent right at the end, but it's something I feel strongly about. I've just written about it in Left Foot Forward, by the way, so you can read about it there.
I would kind of have a similar note, I think, Richard, that Labour needs to move on from the past. And Starmer needs to find some way of holding the government's feet to the fire on what's happening over Brexit without Johnson just being able to say, well, you want to rejoin the EU. I mean, I'm not sure how successful that will be anyway, but I think you're right that there has to be some way of discrediting Brexit in the next, in the coming months and years. And Starmer has to find the courage to talk about Brexit when it's clear that it's doing damage. So I hope that that will happen when Brexit does do damage, which I think it will. And then there just has to be some way of saying, this is what's happening. What are you going to do about it? Why are our supply chains being damaged? So hopefully Leavers will see, you know, that this isn't what they wanted, and Labour is actually defending their interests as well.
Brilliant. Right. Thank you all. Right. We are over 7 o'clock. So we're going to have to finish up there. Sorry, because